The stars had betrayed them, or so it seemed to Senenmut the astronomer priest as he stood atop the temple of Karnak's highest observation platform. His aged eyes scanning the pre-dawn sky with an intensity born of decades spent charting celestial movements, measuring the positions of stars against the horizon, calculating the intricate dance of heavenly bodies that had governed Egyptian life since the time of the first dynasties. And what he saw filled him with a dread so profound that his hands trembled as they gripped the papyrus scroll on which he had been recording his observations for the past 3 months. Observations that confirmed what he had begun to suspect a full year earlier but had been too frightened to acknowledge. Too terrified to report to the priests of higher rank, who would demand explanations he could not provide for phenomena that seemed to violate every principle of cosmic order that the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian astronomy had established. Over 3,000 years of careful study. The star Sopdet, which the Greeks in their coastal trading posts called Sothis, and which would in distant future ages be known as Sirius, had always risen heliacally at the exact moment when the Nile's annual inundation began, that sacred confluence of celestial and terrestrial events that marked the Egyptian New Year. The beginning of Akhet season, when the river would swell with the waters of distant rains in the mysterious southern lands beyond the cataracts, spilling over its banks to deposit the rich black soil that made Egypt the breadbasket of the known world, the gift of the Nile as the old saying went. And the appearance of Sopdet in the dawn sky had been for countless generations the signal that renewal was at hand, that the land would be reborn, that the cycle of life would continue as it always had, as the gods had ordained it should from the moment of creation when the primordial mound first rose from the waters of chaos, and Ra brought light to the darkness. But this year, and Senenmut's heart clenched as he acknowledged the terrible truth, Sopdet had risen too late, nearly 2 full months after the flood had begun, and what was worse, far worse than any single anomaly, however disturbing, was that this discrepancy had been growing gradually year by year for longer than Senenmut had been alive. A slow drift that his own master had first noticed and had mentioned in whispered conversations when they were alone in the observatory, away from the hearing of other priests who might consider such observations to be heresy or madness. For how could the eternal order established by the gods themselves be changing? How could the fixed stars that were supposed to be precisely that, fixed and unchanging, be slowly shifting their positions relative to the seasons, drifting like boats torn from their moorings and carried by currents into unknown waters where no maps existed and no navigation was possible? Senenmut had served as chief astronomer priest of Karnak for 23 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. And the priestly records in the temple archives went back more than 40 generations, carefully maintained observations of celestial events recorded on papyrus and inscribed on stone, preserved with the obsessive care that characterized Egyptian record-keeping. And when Senenmut had finally overcome his reluctance and fear, enough to delve deep into those ancient records, comparing modern observations with those made by priests who had died centuries ago, he had discovered the undeniable pattern. The slow but steady drift of the heliacal rising of Sopdet relative to the Nile's inundation, moving later and later in the solar year. And by extrapolating forward he had calculated, with mathematics that kept him awake through many sleepless nights, that within perhaps 300 years, maybe fewer, the rising of Sopdet would coincide not with the flood season of summer, but with the winter months, with Peret season, when the waters receded and planting began. And the sacred synchronicity between sky and earth that had been the foundation of Egyptian timekeeping, religion, and agricultural practice for as long as anyone could remember would be completely severed. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. For if the stars were not fixed, if the cosmic order was not eternal and unchanging, then what did that say about Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice and order that was supposed to govern all existence? What did it say about the gods themselves, whose perfect wisdom had supposedly established the universe according to immutable laws that would persist forever, and more immediately practical but no less troubling? How was Egypt supposed to organize its agricultural calendar, its religious festivals, its entire understanding of time and seasons, if the celestial markers on which those systems were based were slowly but inexorably drifting away from alignment with the terrestrial realities they were meant to predict and explain? Senenmut descended from the observation platform as the sun rose over the eastern desert, its rays striking the massive pylons of Karnak and setting the painted reliefs ablaze with color. Depicting as they did the eternal triumph of order over chaos, of Ma'at over Isfet, showing pharaohs of ages past smiting enemies and making offerings to gods, asserting through monumental architecture and art the unchanging nature of divine kingship and cosmic order. And the irony of those assertions in light of what Senenmut knew about the slow unraveling of celestial synchronicity was almost too bitter to contemplate, but contemplate it he must. For he had a duty to report his findings to the high priest Amenhotep, who served as intermediary between the priesthood of Amun-Ra and the pharaoh himself. And how did one tell such men that the foundations of Egyptian timekeeping were slowly crumbling, that the new year was drifting, that the stars themselves seemed to be in rebellion against the order the gods had supposedly established? He made his way through the vast temple complex, past courtyards where the morning rituals were already underway, priests purifying themselves in the sacred lake before entering the sanctuary to attend to the statue of Amun-Ra, feeding the god his breakfast of bread and beer and meat, clothing him in fine linen, anointing him with precious oils, performing the daily routines that maintained the relationship between human and divine, that kept the universe functioning as it should. But Senenmut wondered as he walked whether these rituals would continue to have power if the cosmic order they were meant to maintain was itself in flux, whether the ceremonies would become increasingly empty gestures divorced from the celestial realities they were supposed to mirror and influence. The high priest Amenhotep was already awake and receiving reports from various subordinates when Senenmut arrived at his chambers. Rooms furnished with a luxury that reflected the enormous wealth and power of the Amun priesthood, walls decorated with intricate paintings, floors covered with fine rugs imported from distant lands, furniture of ebony and ivory that spoke of trading networks stretching across the known world, and the high priest himself, a man of 60 years whose shaved head gleamed in the lamplight and whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had navigated the treacherous currents of temple politics for decades, looked up from the papyrus he was reading and gestured for Senenmut to approach, his expression suggesting he already suspected that the astronomer priest brought disturbing news. For disturbing news was all that Senenmut had brought him lately, reports of celestial anomalies and calculation discrepancies that suggested problems with the fundamental models by which Egypt understood and measured time. Senenmut bowed with the proper degree of reverence and said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind, "Honored High Priest, I have completed the observations and calculations as you requested, and I must confirm that the heliacal rising of Sopdet occurred this year, a full 58 days after the commencement of the Nile's inundation, the largest discrepancy ever recorded. And the trend lines suggest that this drift will continue and indeed accelerate, with Sopdet's rising moving progressively later in the solar year, until, within approximately 3 centuries, it will coincide with the winter months rather than with the flood season. And the new year, as we have calculated it based on the star's appearance, will be completely out of alignment with the agricultural reality of the Nile's cycle. And I have verified these calculations multiple times and consulted the ancient records, and there is no possibility of error. The drift is real, and it is happening, and it represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of time and cosmic order that we cannot ignore or wish away, no matter how much we might want to." The high priest set down his papyrus and steepled his fingers, his expression grave, and for a long moment he simply sat in silence, considering the implications of what Senenmut had told him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful, the tone of someone who was thinking through a complex problem with multiple dimensions that extended far beyond the merely astronomical into the realms of theology, politics, and social stability. And he said, "I had hoped that your earlier observations were somehow mistaken, that additional data might reveal a different pattern. But if what you say is confirmed beyond doubt, then we face a crisis unlike any that Egypt has confronted in living memory. For our entire civilization is built on the assumption that the cosmos is ordered and predictable, that the gods have established unchanging patterns that we can observe and use to organize our lives, our agriculture, our festivals, our understanding of our place in the universe. And if that assumption is wrong, if the patterns themselves are changing, then we must ask what this means about the nature of the gods, about Ma'at, about whether the universe is truly as ordered as we have always believed, and more immediately, we must decide what to tell the pharaoh, what to tell the people, and whether it is better to acknowledge this truth openly and risk undermining the foundations of social order, or to keep it secret and hope that perhaps in time some explanation or solution will present itself that allows us to maintain the traditional understanding while accommodating the new reality. Senenmut had anticipated this dilemma and had spent many sleepless nights wrestling with the same questions, and he responded, choosing his words with care. The mathematical reality cannot be denied or hidden forever. Honored High Priest, for the discrepancy grows more obvious with each passing year, and eventually even those who are not trained in astronomical observation will notice that the star and the flood are no longer aligned, that the New Year celebration no longer marks the actual beginning of the inundation, and when that awareness spreads among the common people, the damage to public confidence in the priesthood's wisdom and the pharaoh's divine mandate will be far greater than if we acknowledge the problem now and begin working on solutions. And I would propose that we consider reforming the calendar itself, perhaps creating a fixed civil calendar that is synchronized with the solar year and remains stable regardless of stellar movements, while maintaining the religious calendar based on Sopdet's rising as a separate system, allowing us to preserve the sacred traditions while providing practical stability for agricultural and administrative purposes. The high priest considered this proposal with the expression of someone who recognized both its wisdom and its dangers. For calendar reform was not merely a technical matter, but touched on the deepest questions of Egyptian identity and religious belief. And any changes to the system by which time was measured and organized would inevitably be seen by many as an attack on tradition, on the gods themselves, on everything that made Egypt what it was. But Amenhotep was also pragmatic enough to understand that ignoring reality in favor of comfortable illusions was not a strategy that could succeed indefinitely. And eventually, the discrepancy between traditional teachings and observable facts would become so large that it could not be papered over with theological explanations or appeals to divine mystery. He rose from his chair and moved to a window that looked out over the temple complex, watching the morning sunlight illuminate the massive columns and statues that represented thousands of years of accumulated wealth and power, the physical manifestation of Egypt's religious civilization, and he said without turning around, his voice thoughtful and tinged with something that might have been sadness or resignation. What you propose makes sense from a practical standpoint, Senenmut, but you must understand that the implications extend far beyond the technical question of how we measure time. For if we admit that the stars are not fixed, that the cosmic order is not unchanging, that even the gods' perfect design is subject to alteration over time, then we open the door to questions that could undermine the entire theological foundation on which Pharaoh's authority rests, on which the priesthood's power depends, on which the common people's faith is built. And yet I cannot deny that change is coming whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we prepare for it or pretend it is not happening. And perhaps it is better to guide that change, to shape it in ways that preserve what is essential while adapting what must be adapted, rather than to resist blindly until the contradictions become so overwhelming that the entire system collapses in confusion and chaos. Senenmut joined the high priest at the window, and together they looked out over Karnak, that monument to eternity, and the astronomer priest said quietly, "Perhaps the gods are testing us, Tenemi, honored high priest, testing whether we have the wisdom to distinguish between eternal truths and temporary forms, between the essence of Ma'at and its particular manifestations. Perhaps they are asking us to demonstrate that we can maintain order and justice, even as the specific patterns through which those principles have been expressed change over time. And perhaps this is not a crisis of faith, but an opportunity to deepen our understanding of what the gods truly require of us, which is not blind adherence to forms that no longer match reality, but rather the flexibility and intelligence to preserve the sacred within new structures that accommodate new knowledge." The high priest turned to look at Senenmut with an expression of surprise and something that might have been respect, for he had not expected such philosophical depth from a man he had considered primarily a technician of astronomical calculation, and he said, "You think like a theologian, Senenmut?" And perhaps that is what we need in this moment. People who can bridge the gap between technical knowledge and spiritual understanding, who can help us navigate this transition in ways that honor both truth and tradition, both fact and faith. And I think we must convene a council of the wisest priests and scribes, the most learned astronomers and mathematicians, and perhaps also some of the elder statesmen who served previous pharaohs and have seen how Egypt has weathered other crises. And together, we must work out a solution that addresses the practical problems you have identified, while also maintaining the spiritual and social cohesion that depends on shared beliefs about cosmic order and divine will. The council that gathered 3 weeks later in a secure chamber deep within Karnak's administrative wing included some of the most brilliant minds in Egypt, men who had spent lifetimes studying the heavens, the sacred texts, the ancient records, the patterns of the Nile, the mathematics of time and space, and they listened with varying degrees of shock, skepticism, and fascination as Senenmut presented his findings, using detailed charts and calculations to demonstrate the undeniable reality of the stellar drift, showing how the heliacal rising of Sopdet had been moving progressively later in the solar year for centuries. A slow change that had gone mostly unnoticed because it occurred over spans of time longer than any individual lifetime, but which accumulated over generations into a discrepancy that could no longer be ignored or explained away. There was Ptahhotep, the elderly scribe who had served as royal architect and whose mathematical knowledge was legendary, who studied Senenmut's calculations with intense concentration before finally nodding and saying that the numbers were correct, that there was no error in the mathematics, that the phenomenon was real and must be addressed. There was Nebamun, a priest of Ra from Heliopolis, who was considered one of the greatest theological minds of the age, who listened with a deeply troubled expression, but who finally acknowledged that if the celestial order was indeed changing, then theology must evolve to accommodate that reality rather than denying facts in favor of comfortable doctrines. There was Userhat, a former vizier who had administered Egypt's affairs under 2 pharaohs, and who understood better than anyone the practical implications of calendar confusion for tax collection, agricultural planning, trade coordination, and all the myriad activities that required accurate timekeeping and shared understanding of when seasons would begin and end. The debate that followed was intense and wide-ranging, touching on questions of astronomy, theology, mathematics, agriculture, administration, and political philosophy. And it stretched over several days as the assembled experts worked through the implications of Senenmut's discovery and tried to formulate recommendations that would address the practical problems while minimizing social and religious disruption. And gradually, a consensus emerged around the proposal that Senenmut had initially suggested: the creation of a fixed civil calendar based on the solar year that would provide stability for practical purposes, while maintaining the traditional religious calendar based on Sopdet's rising as a parallel system for sacred observances, allowing Egypt to have its bread and eat it too, to preserve tradition while adapting to reality. Ptahhotep took responsibility for working out the mathematical details of the new calendar system, proposing that the civil year should consist of exactly 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 extra days added at the end. A scheme that would remain synchronized with the solar year and the Nile's flood cycle indefinitely, or at least for many centuries, until further adjustments might be required. And he demonstrated through elaborate calculations that this system would provide the stability and predictability that agriculture and administration required, while being simple enough for common people to understand and use in their daily lives. Nebamun undertook the theological task of explaining how the new calendar could be reconciled with traditional religious beliefs, developing an interpretation that presented the stellar drift not as a failure of divine order, but as part of a larger cosmic cycle, suggesting that the gods had designed the universe with multiple interlocking cycles of different lengths, and that what appeared to be disorder from the limited perspective of human lifetimes was actually a higher order that revealed itself only across vast spans of time. And that by recognizing and accommodating these longer cycles, the priests were actually demonstrating deeper wisdom and greater faithfulness to the gods' true design than if they stubbornly insisted on maintaining systems that no longer matched observable reality. UserHat focused on the practical implementation, proposing that the new civil calendar be introduced gradually, first as an optional alternative to the traditional system, allowing farmers and administrators to adopt it as they recognized its advantages, then eventually becoming the standard for everyday use, while the religious calendar based on Sopdet continued to govern temple rituals and sacred festivals, creating a dual system that would allow tradition and innovation to coexist without direct conflict, giving people time to adjust to new ways of thinking about time while respecting their attachment to ancient practices that connected them to their ancestors and their gods. When the council finally concluded its deliberations and prepared its recommendations for presentation to the high priest and ultimately to Pharaoh himself, Senenmut felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that he would not have to bear the burden of this knowledge alone, that wise and thoughtful people had grappled with the implications and developed solutions that might allow Egypt to navigate this transition successfully. But also apprehension about how Pharaoh would react. Whether the ruler of the two lands would accept that even the eternal order was subject to change, whether he would have the wisdom and courage to approve reforms that challenged traditional understandings. And beyond Pharaoh's personal reaction, Senenmut worried about how the common people would respond when they learned that the stars were not as fixed as they had believed, that the new year was drifting, that the cosmic order their ancestors had relied upon for thousands of years was slowly but inexorably changing in ways that required human beings to adapt rather than simply follow established patterns. The presentation to Pharaoh was arranged for a date that the court astrologers deemed auspicious, though Senenmut could not help but reflect on the irony of consulting astrological portents while preparing to explain why the celestial foundations of astrology were themselves shifting. But such ironies were endemic to the situation, part of the complicated dance between old ways and new knowledge that would characterize Egypt's relationship with astronomical reality for generations to come. And as Senenmut prepared his charts and documents for the royal audience, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The awareness that what he was about to do might change the course of Egyptian civilization in fundamental ways, might set in motion transformations that would ripple forward through time, affecting how future generations understood their place in the cosmos and their relationship with the divine. Pharaoh Thutmose III was a man in his middle years, a warrior king who had expanded Egypt's empire through brilliant military campaigns, but who also took seriously his role as the intermediary between gods and humans. The living Horus, who maintained Ma'at through proper ritual observance and righteous rule. And he sat upon his throne in the audience hall surrounded by advisors and courtiers, wearing the double crown that symbolized his sovereignty over Upper and Lower Egypt. His expression grave, as Amenhotep the high priest introduced Senenmut and explained in general terms the nature of the astronomical observations that had prompted this unusual royal consultation. Senenmut prostrated himself according to proper protocol, then rose at Pharaoh's gesture and began his presentation, speaking with a clarity born of having rehearsed these explanations many times before the council of priests and scribes, using visual aids to demonstrate the stellar drift, showing how ancient records compared with modern observations, explaining the mathematics that proved the phenomenon was real and ongoing, and he watched Pharaoh's face carefully, trying to gauge the ruler's reaction, seeing initial skepticism give way to troubled concern as the weight of evidence accumulated. As it became clear that this was not speculation or theory, but documented fact that could not be wished away or dismissed as the fantasies of an overwrought astronomer. When Senenmut concluded his presentation, a heavy silence fell over the audience hall, broken only by the rustle of palm frond fans wielded by servants and the distant sounds of the palace going about its daily business. And Pharaoh sat motionless on his throne for what seemed like an eternity, his eyes fixed on the charts spread before him, his mind clearly working through the implications of what he had heard, and finally he spoke. His voice carrying the authority of divine kingship, but also a very human uncertainty, asking the questions that any intelligent person would ask when confronted with information that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, wanting to know whether the observations might be mistaken, whether there might be alternative explanations, whether the ancient wisdom of Egypt's greatest astronomers might have anticipated this phenomenon and left guidance for how to address it. Ptahhotep stepped forward to respond to the mathematical questions, explaining with the patience of a master teacher why the calculations could not be in error. Why the multiple independent lines of evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Why this was not a temporary aberration, but a long-term trend that would continue for centuries. And his reputation for mathematical precision gave weight to his words, made it difficult for anyone to maintain that the findings were somehow mistaken or fraudulent. Nebamun addressed the theological dimensions, presenting his interpretation of the stellar drift as part of a larger divine plan, suggesting that the gods in their infinite wisdom had created a universe with multiple interlocking cycles, and that human understanding of those cycles necessarily evolved over time as observation and knowledge accumulated, and that there was nothing heretical or blasphemous in recognizing patterns that previous generations had lacked the tools or data to perceive, and his words seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, to provide a framework within which this disturbing information could be accommodated without completely overturning traditional beliefs. Userhat spoke to the practical necessities, explaining how the current calendar system was already causing problems for agricultural planning and tax collection, how farmers were becoming confused about when to plant and harvest, how administrators struggled to coordinate activities across different regions that used slightly different methods of timekeeping, and how the proposed civil calendar would solve these problems while allowing religious traditions to continue undisturbed. And his words carried the weight of administrative experience, of someone who had seen firsthand how calendar confusion created real difficulties for real people trying to accomplish practical tasks. Pharaoh listened to all of this with the intensity of someone who understood that the decision he made would have consequences extending far beyond his own lifetime, that he was being asked to authorize changes that would affect how Egyptians understood time and cosmic order for generations to come. And he asked probing questions that revealed a sharp intelligence and a genuine desire to make the right choice rather than simply the expedient one. And Senenmut felt a growing respect for this ruler, who could have simply rejected the disturbing news or punished the messengers, but who instead engaged seriously with the problem and sought the wisest possible solution. After several hours of discussion and debate, Pharaoh rose from his throne and walked to a window overlooking the Nile, that eternal river whose rhythms had governed Egyptian life since before history began, whose annual flood was the physical manifestation of divine generosity, whose waters meant life and whose absence meant death, and he stood there silently watching the river flow northward toward the delta and the sea. And when he turned back to face the assembled priests and scribes and advisors, his expression had resolved into something like determination, and he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "The gods gave human beings minds capable of observation and reasoning, not so that we would ignore what our eyes show us and our calculations prove, but so that we could understand their creation more deeply and serve them more faithfully. And if the stars are moving in ways that our ancestors did not perceive, that does not mean the gods have failed or that Ma'at has been violated, but rather that we are being given the opportunity to demonstrate wisdom by adapting our practices to accommodate new knowledge while preserving what is essential and eternal in our traditions. And therefore I approve the proposal to establish a civil calendar based on the solar year for practical purposes, while maintaining the traditional religious calendar based on Sopdet's rising for sacred observances. And I charge the high priest and his council to implement this system gradually and carefully, educating the people about why these changes are necessary, ensuring that the transition causes minimum disruption to daily life and agricultural practices, and making clear that this reform strengthens rather than weakens Egypt's covenant with the gods." The relief that washed through the audience hall was palpable, for Pharaoh's endorsement meant that the calendar reform could proceed with the full authority of divine kingship behind it. That those who might have resisted could be shown that opposition to the new system was opposition to Pharaoh himself, and therefore to Ma'at and the cosmic order he represented. But Senenmut also felt a new burden settling onto his shoulders, for Pharaoh's approval meant that the hard work of implementation would now begin. The difficult task of explaining these changes to priests throughout Egypt, to scribes and administrators, to farmers and merchants, to common people whose understanding of time and seasons would have to shift in fundamental ways. And he knew from his years of teaching that changing how people think is far more difficult than solving mathematical problems or making astronomical observations. that human minds resist new ideas with a tenacity that no logical argument can easily overcome, especially when those ideas challenge beliefs that are deeply embedded in tradition and connected to religious faith. The months that followed were among the most challenging of Senenmut's life, for he found himself traveling throughout Egypt as part of a team of priests and scribes charged with explaining the calendar reform to local temples and administrative centers. And everywhere they went, they encountered resistance, ranging from confused skepticism to outright hostility. From priests who insisted that the old ways were sufficient and that change was unnecessary. From farmers who feared that altering the calendar would anger the gods and cause the Nile to fail. From common people who simply could not understand why something that had worked for thousands of years suddenly needed to be different, and Senenmut learned to be patient, to explain the same concepts over and over in different ways, to use analogies and examples that connected abstract astronomical observations to concrete realities that people could see and touch and understand. In a village near Abydos, a grizzled farmer challenged Senenmut angrily, demanding to know why he should trust newfangled calculations over the wisdom of his ancestors, who had successfully grown crops for countless generations using the old calendar. And Senenmut responded by asking the farmer whether he had noticed that the star that was supposed to announce the flood now appeared long after the water had already risen. Whether he had experienced confusion about when to plant, because the traditional markers no longer aligned with actual conditions. And the farmer reluctantly admitted that yes, there had been problems. That the old certainties seemed less certain than they once had been. That he and his neighbors had been arguing about the proper timing of agricultural activities because different people were following different signs that no longer agreed with each other. And Senenmut explained that the new calendar was designed to solve precisely these problems, to provide a stable and reliable framework that would remain synchronized with the Nile's rhythms and the sun's annual journey, regardless of what the stars did. And gradually, grudgingly, the farmer began to see the practical advantages of the reform, even if he remained uncomfortable with the theological implications.